Iran, the video analysis. Did you know that once upon a time, Iran was considered to be the most economically successful country in the Middle East, as well as being deemed one of the most successful countries in the 70s, and not only that, but it was modern age, and the women were not so restricted by the moral laws of the time. With the imperial state of Iran, I get quite confused because royalty is usually a preserved bloodline over centuries. In the case of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, I don't believe there was a monarch that he was directly related to. His predecessor was his father, but prior to his father, there was no other relative. Reza Shah's father, also known as Shah Reza Pahlavi, formerly Khan, was also a ruler of Iran, alongside Sayyid Zia, who appointed Reza Shah Pahlavi as Prime Minister, until this eventuated to the legal proclamation of making him monarch of Iran in 1925. Prior to the House of Pahlavi being the legalized monarch, it was the House of Qajar that came before. They were initially overthrown by rebels because they sought to restore the 1906 constitution. The restoration of the 1906 constitution equated to the ability of selecting another to be Shah. Under the reign of the Qajar house, Iran appeared to be prospering. Before the coup that removed the Qajar house from their reign, one could fairly say that even under this government, Persia's future looked promising. The Grand Majlis are another name for the Iranian parliament, the Islamic Consultative Assembly, and they legalized many reforms. They justifiably abolished class representation and designed 5 new seats in the Majlis for minorities. 2 seats were for Armenians and 1 seat each for Jews, Zoroastrians, and Assyrians. This meant a designated voice for those of different cultures and faiths to be fairly represented in parliament. The Majlis also somewhat democratized the electoral system, diminishing the electoral dominance of Tehran and even lowering the voting age from 25 to 20. These are all positive steps to assist in giving a voice to the underdog and most citizens. Sadly, he was seen as an ineffective ruler, most likely because he permitted outside, possibly corrupt, interference, particularly by the British Empire and Russian Empire. Russian and British troops fought against the Ottoman Empire forces in Persia during World War I. The state of Persia was placed in a precarious situation due to its fragile economic state. His government was regrettably at the clemency of foreign influence. Loans were acquired by the Imperial Bank of Persia, and additionally, under the Anglo-Persian Agreement, Persia did not obtain what it rightfully should have. It was merely a minor amount of the income that was generated by the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. Meanwhile, rebels and warlords ruled the rural areas and the countryside. At long last, in 1921, on the 21st of February, he was targeted in a military coup by Colonel Reza Khan, the Minister of War, as well as the Persian Cossack Brigade. He ultimately detained the position of Prime Minister. Reza used manpower tactics and force in the way of 3,000 men and 18 machine guns to secure his position as the new Shah and end the Qajar dynasty. Oddly, this coup was free of bloodshed. The new Prime Minister Reza Khan's first actions was withdrawing from the frowned-upon Anglo-Persian Agreement and subsequently signed the Russo-Persian Treaty of Friendship. Thusly, this agreement cancelled all former treaties between the two countries and also afforded them equal shipping rights in the Caspian Sea. The first Shah of Persia was stripped of any remaining powers until Ahmad Shah went into exile with his family in 1923. He was not particularly competent as a ruler, and his failing health led to his disinterest in matters of state. He lived the rest of his days in Europe and was formally deposed on the 31st of October 1925. This brought on the beginning of the Pahlavi reign and the end of the Qajar dynasty. So, the imperialism of Iran is not like the royalty in other countries, as they can be essentially elected. However, the Qajar reign in Persia was over 135 years until they were deposed. Not too much is known about the Qajar dynasty as far as I'm aware, but it appears that, like most monarchs, it was a hereditary line up until the change in constitution in 1906, which meant Shahs from that point could be elected, unless I have misunderstood. From 1925, the first Shah of Iran was the first elected of the Pahlavi line. Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was a controversial ruler, but very intent on bringing Iran out of an antiquated mindset and into a more westernized space. This was deemed a treasonous move because his resistors saw this as anti-Islamic and therefore anti-Iran. The first Shah Reza Pahlavi was seen as an obstacle to the British forces, which occupied much of Iran during this time. Reza Shah proved to be unpopular and was forced by the invading British to abdicate his throne in favour of his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who replaced his father as Shah on the throne on the 16th of September 1941. Why are the British involved in every aspect of a country that has nothing to do with them? And it was foolish of either Reza to presume this forced abdication or coup would not take place again. So, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi Shah became the preferred choice, as it was assumed that he would be easier to manipulate and more of a puppet at the beck and call of the British. Iranians in government alongside him were not confident in his wanting to be in every detail. Rather than adhering to the constitutional monarchical system like he had initially vowed when replacing his father, he became paranoid and also feared regicide. Through the advancement of time, the second Pahlavi of the Pahlavi Dynasty had disappointed his people, and it was evident that he was reaping the harvest of years of brutal, unpopular policies. This consisted of his abusive use of the secret police that controlled dissent, with arbitrary arrests and tortures which had finally caught up on him. It's worth stating that Tsar Nicholas of Russia also utilized his own version of the secret police, which in turn made him a target to the Bolsheviks, just as it occurred for Shah Reza Pahlavi. Bearing in mind that he was an effective ruler and the West seemingly approved of the economic success of Iran, but they were not popular with a contingent of his own people, and whilst exteriors demonstrated his competency and kindness and willingness for a modern society, his arbitrary arrests and utilization of secret police can be seen or were seen as a contradiction to the character he portrayed publicly. Also, the regicide would never be worth his worry, as most know it was cancer that ultimately took his life. Mohammad Reza implemented the White Revolution. This was a series of social, economic, and political reforms, with the overall concept being to convert a seemingly forgotten nation into a global superpower through modernization by nationalizing key industries and land redistribution. He very generously invested in the infrastructure, subsidies and land grants for peasant populations, profit sharing for industrial workers, and construction of nuclear facilities. For all the evils perceived by others by him, real or inflated, it is my belief that he truly wanted his country to prosper and for Iran to have economic success. He wanted Iran to be worthy in economical categories alongside the United States with similar freedoms. This was a time of personal wealth for the vast population until religious zealots committed an act of mutiny against Shah Pahlavi for not adhering to Quranic teachings, amongst many other complaints. One other primary complaint was his apparent westernization of the nation, because, there's nothing worse than technological advances and personal wealth of the people. In saying that, westernization today is clearly evil, or minimally completely off track. Back then, nothing could have been more beneficial to a society than adopting the mantra of the West is best, with a beautiful Persian twist, as was the case at that time. He also initiated the nationalization of Iran's natural resources and literacy programs, which were the most effective in the world. How tragic, but this was all lost in the end. His first major public row with Ayatollah Khomeini took place in 1962, when the Shah adjusted the local laws to permit Iranian Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, and Baha'i to take the oath of office for municipal councils utilizing their preferred sacred texts and not electing the Quran. Khomeini wrote to the Shah to express his disapproval that the Quran be the only religious text exclusively used to swear members into the municipal council despite their faith. From the point of view of Khomeini, what he desired was to honor Islam, right? Down to the point of a lawful Islamic foundation. What Islam does well is that it doesn't budge from its foundation. Iran is far better than Christianity when it comes to consistency and staying constant. To amend that statement, I should clarify that the adherents of Islam are better at committed intolerance than adherents of Christianity. Christians tend to get too caught up in wanting to please those around them and seeking approval from the immoral, flawed humanity that governs us. Devout Muslims are not as stupid when it comes to this. However, there is certainly room for improvement regarding the running of a society and nation. The detractors and clergy took to demonstrations and making their feelings known. This put much pressure on the Shah, and so these laws were soon repealed, though they were rightly reinstated during the White Revolution of 1963. So, here in the West, like Australia, Canada, America, the United Kingdom and many European nations, we tend to bend over backwards to appease minorities. This isn't always such a horrible thing to do, but when one enters into a country to call it home, it is usually the responsibility of the immigrants to assimilate to the rules and stipulations of that land. I believe that, and as such, I believe that when in Rome, do as the Romans do. In saying that, progress was not always a bad thing like it is today, and for a religion that is beyond medieval with its capital punishments and crimes, especially toward gay people, the Shah was not intending to offend or blaspheme, but simply wanted the great nation of Persia to fulfill its greatest achievements and for it to become a superpower country and become more modern and be an economic powerhouse. To this day, Iranians, whom prefer to be called Persians, are divided about the role the last Shah of Iran played in the betterment of the country and its people. Many websites claim that what made the Pahlavi line such a horrible leader was the desire to somewhat secularize the nation, a controversial move considering he went about it by basically banning the hijab on January 8th of 1936. Certain religious zealots would claim that by banning the hijab, one is removing the veil and distance set by the Islamic parameters between the two sexes. The hijab should be a personal and spiritual decision between the woman and Allah. It is not up to anyone to ban it outright or to force the wearing of it outright. The Shah perhaps could have made it more of a choice than a dictatorial clean sweep. However, I imagine he did this because he believed it was oppressive and that the women were not happy wearing it. It was dripping in good intentions, but people tend to overreact with religion, which is the primary subject. According to the website Khamenei Iran News, the article titled 6 Major Atrocities by Reza Khan Pahlavi in Banning Hijab for Iranian Women. Let me quote, "Hijab is a wholesome practice that benefits men and women as well as society. It renders the society healthy and safe. They had plans to inflict all the malicious abuse suffered by women in Western societies on Muslim Iranian women, using strong-arm tactics. Reza Khan carried out this plan inside the country." This is Reza Shah Pahlavi's father. What the Western women achieved by plummeting into the quagmire of corruption and perversion was the destruction of the family. Those women could only advance in science and politics or in social activities by merely removing hijab was an absolute falsity. Women could do so by holding on to their hijab and decency, and we have experienced the fact in our Islamic country. Banning hijab was a prelude to stripping women of their dignity and decency. It was meant to keep people busy with powerful sexual desires. End quote. This quote sounds a little too fanatical, but it doesn't mean there is not an air of truth to the comment. When men and women today decide to dress like total whores, it can bring forth desires and impulses that can be dangerous for either sex when an aggressor takes advantage of a foolish or vulnerable moment. The aggressor should be castrated and killed. And so the writer of this article believes that if women were to dress modestly, cannot bring about the dangers of women in the West who objectify themselves for male attention and exploit themselves sexually for male approval. An honorable position, however, when one really analyzes the attire of Iranians from the 60s to the 70s, it looks like looking at photos of any other modern developing country growing economically and moving forward. To be fair, Muslim apologists would claim that this way of dressing is too reminiscent of the West and therefore on a road to promiscuity and exploitation. The Islamic thinking that modest dress defaults to no sexual assault or rape is a falsehood. Don't get me wrong, it is more respectable and effective, but even mainstream leftist articles report on this. The Guardian, which is extremely leftist, says how the hijab has made sexual harassment worse in Iran. That's just one article. The Age, the same thing. Hijab wearers blame crime, not clothes. Iranian officials do not regularly release nationwide statistics on rape. According to one official though, there were 1,313 rape cases reported in 2014. Here is a successfully documented rape case. Pure evil, forced sex beasts who gang rape women in front of her husband after tying him up are hanged in Iran. This was in 2021 by The Sun. These photos are truly upsetting. I could imagine having wanted to see this country in its prime, purchasing a home here during its peak, but we are in a position today where Iran is once again repeating history. Iran is going through a new revolution. It is easy for Muslims to claim that the way Iran was before was too sinful, and that Shah Reza Pahlavi was a dictator compared to Khomeini. Well, call me spoilt, but I think freedom is a wonderful thing, and any country that removes clothing choice for black and drab religious attire is really removing the beauty of freedom of choice and limiting fashion, as well as confining its people to thought crimes. Bear in mind that thought crimes are not real. This should be reserved for countries like North Korea or Afghanistan. A desire for a secular government would be seen by anyone who is a person of faith as some sort of a threat to the God you worship or the foundations of where your country came from. I'm not surprised that Shah Reza Pahlavi's want for a more secular government had backlash, but having stated this, most Christian nations are not purely Christian in that their laws derive from the Holy Bible. The Ten Commandments are at the forefront of most nations' laws. A secular nation, however, makes me angry as well, but we understand that a relationship between man and God is a personal one, and as long as most of our laws are reflective of a morally objective understanding, the morals of humans should be up to them. John F. Kennedy was a proponent of the concept that being head of state was a symbol of standing up for every citizen and religious group. Iran consisted of Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, Assyrians, and Armenians. The Shah wanted these groups fairly represented, which perhaps through Islam was not a possibility, but through a secular government which borrows from Islam would or could have had more success. It is up to society to reflect these morals, but we cannot punish stealing or cheating on your wife with death or a severe jail sentence. These sins should be dealt with via one's own conscience and through personal accountability and even a court trial if need be. These sorts of crimes are between you and your God. If Shah Reza Pahlavi had permitted to continue with Iran how he had envisioned, we might have had the first advanced Islamic nation where women can dress as they did in the 60s and 70s, modest but modern, and it could have progressed to a to becoming a superpower country like the USA or China, but it was not given the chance due to outside forces working against the progress of Iran and the backdoor deals that occurred with the religious zealots like the supporters of Ayatollah Khomeini, and the insecurities of Western nations observing the success and rise of a Middle Eastern nation like Iran. President Jimmy Carter of the United States and Prime Minister James Callaghan of Britain worked against Iranian interests. Initially, they had wanted Mohammad Reza Pahlavi's father to abdicate because they believed having the son would mean he would be a puppet for them. Instead, he exercised power where they did not anticipate. It resulted that Britain shamefully dropped its support for the Shah before the 1979 revolution began. This was an attempt to ingratiate themselves with terroristic Iranian opposition led by Khomeini. Not only that, there is actually leaked documentation that is declassified from the CIA that clearly shows that in 1953 the United States also meddled with Iran. When Khomeini's tyrannical reign was at last in power, Whitehall took it to a place of arming Iran against the Soviet Union. The former Foreign Secretary of Britain during the administration of Prime Minister James Callaghan, David Owen, was quoted saying the following: "There was no honor in my decision, just the cold calculation of national interest." A blatant show of double-crossing for the alleged interest of the people of Britain, which he himself claimed was a despicable act. These images of women burning their hijabs in the Middle East has always conjured up feelings of joy for me, as you really see the sentiment in their eyes and how much it means to them. Well, this is where Iran stands now, today. A new Iranian revolution, but unlike the revolution of adhering so strictly to Sharia and stripping the population of its freedoms and rights and discrimination against Christians, Zoroastrians, Jews, the revolution has a real show of unity amongst the people, and this is due to what's happened to the young 22-year-old Mahsa Amini, a young lady who was beaten to death essentially by the morality police. Due to the nature of her beatings being so severe, she was taken to Qasra Hospital, where doctors declared she was brain dead and suffered a stroke.
These are the videos Iran doesn't want you to see. Police firing in the streets, women cutting their hair, burning hijabs in rage.
Any country's police force that treats any citizen, in this case a woman, who allegedly wore her hijab inappropriately and deem it a just reaction to a non-crime really must change their ways and improve their laws. Mahsa Amini deserved better than this, and hopefully these new protests and marches will make a difference. These protests are a wonderful show of Iranian nationalism, solidarity, and the people finally demonstrating that they have had the last straw. The first revolution of 1979 could be characterized as dissent against an autocratic regime and bringing the power back to the people. What resulted was an extremist Shiite state. The people, men and women alike, wanted to return to a more submissive society that honored Allah, and so they achieved this goal much to their own chagrin, as today, whilst Iran is not like it was during the 80s and 90s and permits women to vote and have an education, it is a long way to go before it can really say it is somewhat closer to being progressive. And I don't mean like the West currently, where we teach students that men can have periods, but simply freedom of thought, freedom of color with clothing, and equal treatment of all religious groups and ethnicities. So where does the future lie for Iran? Iran does not need to bow down to the concepts and free thinkers of the West, but it would be fabulous to witness in my lifetime a kind of renaissance for this great country of beautiful magic fairy tales like genies, magic carpets, and banquets and paradise.
Gardens have always had a special place in Persia throughout our history. In fact, the word paradise is a Persian word. It's hard to believe, isn't it, that the idea of paradise will always be intimately connected with Iran. Whenever I think of what's happening to my country, I try to remember its gardens.
One can visit any country around the world and come face to face with dangers and a risk of safety, but it would be so heartwarming for that fear to virtually disappear in a nation within the Middle East. The point is that no matter what takes place, there will always be detractors who oppose a current ruler and the politics and how it reflects or does not reflect the doctrine of said nation. Here in the West, we certainly have not got it right. And with the dissolvement of God and the uprising of woke culture and social justice garbage, we can certainly take lessons from Muslims and their intolerance of stupidity. Meanwhile, they take it too far and allow their blind faith to reach a point of extremism where it leads to beating a woman for wearing a hijab slightly off, resulting in a human rights crisis. What the future holds cannot be known. I suppose the global elites have an idea about the direction they will manipulate things toward. But overall, if Iran can return to a place like the progressivism of the 60s and 70s, but not abandon its Quranic foundation, but also not honor it in the extremes of stoning people for petty crimes or even sexual crimes, and not endanger the lives of people by using secret police and torturing them, but in defense of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the United States does that also. This is not exclusively a Muslim thing. It is easier stated as a leader of a country thing. Iran, I wish you success in your future. To end this video, I find it fitting to mention a quote from Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. My main mistake was to have made an ancient people advanced by forced marches toward independence, health, culture, affluence, comfort.